want to see where we're headed, just take a look at Europe and some of the places that have already enshrined the homosexual agenda. Here's a story about Tony Miano. This is from Virtue Online. Tony Miano, a retired deputy sheriff from Los Angeles County, California, was arrested in London, England earlier this week for preaching on abstaining from sexual immorality, both heterosexual and homosexual, in downtown Wimbledon. He was found to be in violation of Public Order Act Section 5 for, quote, using homophobic speech that could cause people anxiety, distress, alarm, or insult, end quote. He had been preaching for about 25 minutes from 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 1 through 12. He got cut off by the Metropolitan Police, and they said that although preaching is not an offense, they said the specific part of the Bible that you're preaching from was interpreted as homophobic by a woman who called them to complain. Now, this Tony Miano, he was teaching a biblical view regarding all forms of sexual expression, all forms of sexual immorality, but the thing he got dinged for was saying that homosexual behavior was a sin. They could care less that he was saying that fornication is a sin. They could care less that he was saying sexual immorality was a sin. They could care less that he was saying adultery was a sin. They could care less that he was saying pornography was a sin. The only thing they cared about is that he said that homosexuality was a sin. And they said, when you go to the Bible and start talking about that, that is a criminal offense. Now, that's the significant thing to see here, is a criminal offense in the UK in a public setting to teach a biblical view of sexuality when it comes to homosexuality. Criminal offense. He got handcuffed, taken to jail. He was looking at facing jail time. He was in jail, it turns out, for 24 hours. And then he was facing the threat of prosecution, and he could be ordered to stay in England until completion of his trial. It could be 4 to 5 months. He'd be detained in England simply for declaring in a public setting the biblical view of homosexuality. Now, he's finally released after enough people complained, but that just shows you the jeopardy that the homosexual agenda represents to religious liberty. I sent a tweet out about this. If you're not on my tweet, Brian J. Fisher is my Twitter handle. And by the way, I want to be sure you understand that you have access to Focal Point on the internet. We audio and video stream our program at afr.net. So if you are in a community where you don't have access to one of our radio stations, you have family and friends in other communities. I mean, they can listen to this in Australia. They can listen to Focal Point anywhere in the world because we live stream it at afr.net. So just go to afr.net. You can live stream it. Anybody anywhere in the world can listen to this program. And I tweeted out a link to this where two Christians at a gay pride event in Seattle were simply holding up signs about a biblical view of homosexuality, about God's offer of salvation. That's all they were doing. Just holding up signs. I've got the video. I've watched the video, sent the link to the video. You can see it for yourselves. When they began to be harassed, surrounded by homosexual protesters, some of them using very strong profanity and vulgarity. And then at one point, these Christians simply holding these signs, they weren't even talking. They weren't harassing anybody. They weren't yelling at anybody. They weren't even speaking. They were silently standing in a public place with signs that urged people to repent of their sin and promise God's forgiveness if they did, just declaring the basic truth of the gospel. They were assaulted. They were beaten. They were thrown to the ground. Their signs were ripped out of their hands. They were jumped on until finally the police came and restored order. So again, just a reminder of just what a threat to religious liberty the homosexual agenda represents. You might be familiar, maybe seen some preliminary publicity on a new movie called Ender's Game. It's starring Harrison Ford. It's based on a novel written by Orson Scott Card back in 1984, and it's set like 100 years into the future. But the homosexual activists are out there launching a boycott of this movie because Orson Scott Card believes in a biblical view of marriage. And he was part of the board of the National Organization for Marriage, which has defended it. But now they're trying to launch this nationwide boycott of this movie. And then the last thing before we go to the phones, 888-589-8840. I've talked to you about this before, but I want to just remind you again of this is why we have to fight the homosexual agenda. We cannot give 1 inch, not 1 centimeter, not 1 millimeter, not 1 square inch of turf can we surrender without a fight. We've got to contest the forces of homosexual fascism at every step, every advance they make. This is a story about a baker in Colorado whose name is Jack Phillips. He's one of the owners of a bake shop called Masterpiece Cake Shop. These 2 homosexuals came into his bake shop, Dave Mullins and Daniel Craig. They'd gotten married in Massachusetts. They come to Colorado. They want to have some kind of a ceremony in Colorado, even though legally it means absolutely nothing. Gay marriage is against the law in Colorado. They still wanted to have a ceremony. That's fine. They can have their ceremony if they want. But they wanted Jack Phillips to bake them a cake, a wedding cake. And he said, look, I can't do it. Not going to be able to do it. It would be a violation of my most deeply held principles and convictions about the nature of marriage and sexuality. So I'm not going to be able to do it. Plenty of other bakers in town, I'm sure, will be happy to do it. They didn't have any trouble getting a cake for their wedding ceremony, but that wasn't enough for them. It was not enough for them. I mean, they're the ones that say you got to be tolerant, you got to live and let live. Why do people want to keep messing with other people's business? Why can't they leave people alone? And here they're getting all up in this guy's kitchen, all up in this guy's oven, because he simply made a choice to run his business based on his Christian principles. So they have sued him. They filed a complaint that seeks to compel Masterpiece Cake Shop to cease and desist its refusal to serve gay couples. So now this lawsuit, they're trying to get a judge to order this bake shop to violate its own religious principles, to violate its own conscience, and do business with any homosexual couple that walks in the door, no matter what the event is that they are intending to celebrate. Now, if he loses this court case, he could wind up facing fines of up to $500 per case, and he could wind up in jail for a year. So again, ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder, it is a zero-sum game. Every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. That's why it's a serious, serious issue for us. It puts the First Amendment, it puts the church, it puts the Christian faith in jeopardy every time the homosexual agenda moves forward. And you know, we've talked about this Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage overturning DOMA, and essentially, they upheld Prop 8, really, is what they did, but the courts and the governor in California have interpreted the ruling as if they'd overturned Proposition 8. So the governor's going pell-mell ahead with normalizing or legalizing same-sex unions in California, despite the fact it's still against the law. Prop 8 is still in effect legally in California. But, hey, if President Obama will not be constrained by the law, why should they? If he can set aside any law he doesn't like, why can't they? And that's what they are doing. But when the majority opinion, Anthony Kennedy said the only reason you could be for natural marriage is if you are a homophobic bigot. The only reason you would support natural marriage, not because you believe in sexual morality, not because you believe in the optimal nurturing environment for children. There's got to be something wrong with you. You've got to have hate in your heart. You've got to have malice in your heart. You want to hurt homosexuals. You want to disparage them. You want to demean them. You want to injure them. That was the basis on which they overturned DOMA. Now, the ACLU is taking that same reasoning. They've already this week launched lawsuits against same-sex marriage bans in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Virginia. The onslaught is beginning. Focal Point AFR Talk, back with your calls in 2.
Our men and women in the armed forces are requesting